Roar!
Ew. The Skyla Pseudonym by iisaw. Chapter 17. First Blood. Our gas reserve cylinders were at 100% full, and there were 4 large crates of crushed minerals aboard that could be used to completely refill them all. Every usable gem was as full as could be, which was almost 120% of capacity by equestrian standards. 1. Thanks to Cream Puff's extravagant notion of viculating, we still had about a week of food aboard, even considering our herd of passengers. And with the sheer number of hoofs aboard because of those passengers, all repairs were completed by the afternoon of the first day we got back. 1. The unicorn's little nonsense song worked wonders. And that left me with nothing to do but wait. I hate waiting. I set up a watch post on a crag where the dock at Emberdale could be observed through a spyglass, and I checked in with the various ponies who took turns there so often that the raptor set had to be recharged. I had a long discussion with Skyla about freeing Loose Leaf, and she reluctantly agreed that it would be the best course of action, even though it was risky. So, I primed Loose Leaf for her mission as well as I could, and left her alone with Swiftwing to say their goodbyes. They spoke quietly for a few minutes and then hugged each other. Loose Leaf took off and swooped around to hover near where I was standing on the quarterdeck. Her eyes gleamed with joyful purpose.
"I will not fail you, mistress. I swear it."
I smiled softly, showing only a little of my teeth.
"I know you won't, my faithful follower. Go well."
She did a couple of wing rolls and a loop from sheer exuberance as she flew away.
"Doesn't it bother you that she's so fanatical?"
Skyla asked me as she watched her go. I sighed, casting my thoughts back across the years. I couldn't stretch the accepted definition of bothered far enough to include nostalgia for a simpler time slightly tinged with envy, so I said,
"Not really,"
and left it at that. Shortly thereafter, I excused myself to go and visit the other native Pegasus. After a few of Cream Puff's excellent meals, and being visited by some of Nebula's Pegasus and Earth Pony crew, Cloudcutter had calmed down quite a lot. As I had nothing better to do except pester ponies trying to do their jobs, I thought it might be worthwhile to talk to him again. He jumped up when I entered the space we'd set up for him in the hold and backed as far away from me as his shackles would allow. I lay down on the deck and casually began preening my wings. Pointy teeth made the task a bit easier than usual.
"We're going to release you the day after tomorrow,"
I said casually, nipping off the broken end of a covert.
"You can take whatever action you want, but I'd highly suggest reporting back to your superiors rather than trying to attack or track us. I hold no grudge against you, but there are a lot of armed unicorns aboard who would love to have an excuse to shoot you."
I pulled the feather tip out of my mouth with magic and brought up a bit of the dark stuff to decay it into fine ash.
"And that would be a shame."
"You're going to kill us anyway, so what would it matter?" he said sullenly.
"What? Why in Tartarus would I do that?"
I nosed at my right wing and gave it a little shake to settle the feathers into position.
"I mean, do you have any idea how long that would take?"
He frowned at me warily. "That's what the legends say you'll do."
"Oh, yes,"
I chuckled, stretching out my left wing for inspection.
"Beating ponies with their own wings, I think the prophecy says? That's completely ridiculous. Do you know the definition of hyperbole?"
No," he admitted.
"A wild exaggeration for emphasis, often comedic."
"What?" He was thoroughly confused by then. Right where I wanted him. "It was a joke?"
Knowing me, it was a fit of irritation at being frustrated, but I can't be sure. It was almost certainly a different me. Oh stars, just look at the state of the secondary. I got hold of the ragged feather and tried to smooth it back into place as the Pegasus sputtered and made an inarticulate noise.
What do you mean, a different you?
Cloudcutter finally managed to ask. I sighed and gave up on the secondary. There are other worlds beside your own.
Parallel universes, yes,
he said.
What of them?
Wait, you know multiversal theory, but not the definition of hyperbole? Oh, honestly. I took a deep breath to calm myself and then said, So you know that...
Yes, we know you came from beyond. That's why the reflex gates were built, to keep you away.
Oh. I blinked in surprise. Interesting. Like the one in the desert south of Ursa Negro? He looked a bit surprised, but nodded. Well, that explains the feedback that had trapped us in that world. It didn't seem to have functioned exactly as designed, but it hadn't been an accident after all. Well, you might have succeeded because I'm not the Twilight Sparkle that the prophecy is about. I'm one of the other ones. Oh no, you're not going to faint too, are you?
More of you,
he wheezed, wide-eyed. Thousands at the very least. And I'll have you know that they're mostly very nice ponies. 2. Please calm down, I'm not going to hurt you. 2. And other things.
Then why are you here?
It was a reasonable enough question, but I didn't think going into my family's dynamics would be very productive. I'm here to fix an imbalance. The Empire treats its unicorn citizens like slaves, and that's got to stop.
But they're naturally inferior. The Empire gives them a place and a purpose,
he protested. I tamped down my disgust. And the reason the Earth ponies rule over you is that they are naturally superior to Pegasi?
What? Of course not. The legends say we were the masters until you came.
He snorted in righteous racism.
The Black Lips are always telling us that serving the Stompers is the only sure way to keep you from returning to destroy us. We've been true to our duty, but here you are. So the stupid scribes didn't know what they were talking about.
I had suspected as much. It made sense that another me had stumbled upon that world, seen the terrible imbalance in power, and had tried to fix it. All I, or rather she, had managed to do was transplant a different tribe to the top of the power pyramid. I shook my head sadly and stood up. Captain Skyla was right, I said half to myself. All of you've got these awful prejudices so ingrained in your minds that there isn't any way to fix it. I suppose we are going to have to destroy the Empire.
What? But you said...
Oh, don't worry, I said over my shoulder as I walked away. I'm going to kill the Empire, not the ponies in it. The Pegasi will survive. I suggest finding somewhere with a nice climate where the grazing is good. Just don't do anything stupid and you'll be fine. Targeted interviews with all the rebel unicorns and incidental activities, such as designing a few specialized waveguides, fully occupied me for a day and a half until it was time to make the grab. In the late morning of the second day, Sirocco called in from the watch post and told us that the barge had been loaded and the river ponies were casting off the lines. The nebulas scrambled, some hauling in the anchors and ground lines, and some readying net launchers, guns, and grappling equipment. Skyla stood on the quarterdeck, and in her armor and goggles, cutlass slung by her side and spyglass to an eye, she looked like a perfect recruiting poster for an aeronautical misbehavior. My conscience nibbled at me, and not gently either. I stood on the forecastle deck, to one side of the butt of the bowsprit, checking over my gear one last time. Everything was in place, exactly where it had been the first 2 times I'd examined it.
The speaking tube next to me whistled. It was Ow, reporting from the copula that Sirocco was returning from the watchpost, coming in a few points off our starboard bow. I relayed the information to Filigree, who was acting as sergeant for the gunners and catapult crews in the waist. The last thing we needed was for Sirocco to get shot by some nervous lubber on a gun. Cloudcutter was brought on deck, and I gave him one more bit of advice before I unlocked his hobbles and wing straps.
Be smart. Get your friends and family together and take them to safety.
He didn't reply and flew straight south over the mountains as fast as he could go. Nebula's engines turned over slowly, taking us south-southeast as Lance carefully vented gas to keep us as low over the sharp cracks as was safe. The river came in view below a granite crest where the mountains fell away to the valley below, and I put my spyglass to my eye.
"I have the barge, Captain,"
I said to the speaking tube to the quarterdeck.
"I make her half a league below the town, just entering a heavily wooded reach." "Understood, Miss Nightshade,"
came her reply. Nebula's engines came to half ahead, and her bow turned southward. It took us about 10 minutes to line up with the straightish reach of the river, and then Skyla gave the order to let fly the colors, and we swooped down on the barge. The river ponies had a couple of guns, and they were foolish enough to fire at us as we came down into the water alongside their craft. Fortunately, they didn't hit any pony, and all the Nebulas kept their heads and didn't fire back. Well, not at the barge crew at least. 2 shots from the big guns slammed into the trees on the bank and blew shattered woods and burning leaves into the air in an impressive display of power.
"Drop your guns on the deck and heave to, or the next shots go right amidships!"
Filigree called out to the barge's crew.
"We won't hurt you if you surrender, we only want your cargo!"
There was a hurried discussion about the craft, and then the guns were dropped. The big ponies with the long poles set them against the current and leaned into them, and the barge slowed and stopped. We rigged a spar as a crane boom and quickly swung all the crates aboard while the barge ponies stared in wonder. We also scooped up their guns, but didn't go as far as searching them for valuables.
"Pirates?"
one of them asked of no pony in particular.
"On this river? You're all mad. That's nothing but pig iron and metals. The fleet'll chase you down and burn you from the sky."
Skyla laughed at him.
"I hope they'll try it. That'll save us the trouble of hunting for them."
We finished lowering the crates down the main hatchway to the cargo hold, and the unicorns floated the big wooden hatches back on.
"All secure, Captain,"
Stalwart Lance said.
"Gentle ponies, I thank you,"
Skyla called out to the barge crew from the quarterdeck, giving them a casual wave of her wing.
"Nebulas, let's away! We have an empire to topple!"
The engines roared back to life, and we lifted from the river in a shower of water, and swirls of spray filled the vortices that set the barge to rocking. I kept my spyglass fixed on the southern sky as we rose above the trees, and was rewarded by the sight of 2 blobs in the distance. The speaking tube from the copula whistled, and Owl reported sighting the distant airships as well.
"It seems Cloudcutter has done as you expected, Majesty. Good thing we discussed the river job where he could overhear us."
I grinned.
"Are the guns in place?"
There was a short pause, and I assumed she was looking aft from the copula to check on the crews.
"Linwood's team are still working on mounting their weapons at the main masthead, but seem to be nearly ready."
I hated depending on rebel unicorns with only a few days of training to lead gunnery teams, but the original Nebulas were stretched too thin.
"Good. With 2 ships against us, the plan is to do horseshoe punch. It'll be pretty scary for the lubbers, so I'm trusting to you to keep them in line and doing their jobs."
"This will be but a small task. They are sensible ponies and fear this one more than the Imperials," she said. Even through the speaking tube, I could hear the humor in her voice. I switched to the quarterdeck tube and reported the situation to Skyla.
"Very good, Miss Nightshade. she said. Any Pegasus support? I scanned the sky around the oncoming ships again. None visible, but they may be staying aboard until we're close. We'll have to be ready to switch to Flaming Cowkick if they have too many flyers. That will probably be Owl's call. She's the one who will have the best view of them. There was a moment of silence and I turned to look aft. I could see that Skyla was still bent over the speaking tube. Be careful. That's an order. Aye, aye, Captain, I replied and replaced the whistle plug in the tube. After a minute, I could make out more details of the Imperial ships. They were smaller than Ironhoof, but still larger than Nebula and had only 4 engines apiece. They each had 3 gun turrets, one at the bow below the bridge and 2 about 3/4 of the way aft on either side. Nebula's engines roared to full ahead as we charged towards the enemy. Long streamers of falling water appeared beneath the Imperial ships as they maneuvered to keep the advantage of height on us. The deck under my hoofs pressed upwards as we released ballast as well, making a show of countering their tactic. It was time for me to draw out their Pegasi. Swiftwing, I called out over my shoulder.
Here, ma'am,
he said, touching down on the deck behind me. He was wearing wing blades in addition to his armor and had a sword and a crossbow slung on either side of his harness. I frowned at the sight of all the weapons. You do understand the plan? If we are heavily opposed, you run for it.
I understand, Miss Nightshade,
he said flatly. All right then, let's go poke the dragon. I leapt over the bow and flapped hard for altitude. Nebula was still a furlong below the Imperial ships and, as we intended to preserve that apparent disadvantage, Swift and I needed to climb at least twice that distance before we got in range of the enemy's guns. The gunner in the bow turret of the lead ship took a shot at us as we closed. It missed by a good distance and had dissipated enough that it wouldn't have done much damage even if it had hit one of us. It was nice to know that their ponies were nervous enough to make mistakes. From what little experience we had with Imperial tactics, it seemed that their ships typically only carried a very small contingent of Pegasi. But we couldn't count on them being too stupid or hidebound not to adapt to a new and different threat, and with so few flyers of her own, Nebula was vulnerable to being swarmed. Swift and I had the unenviable job of finding out what their strength was while Nebula was still able to change plans, if necessary. We got far enough above their ships to be out of effective crossbow range and readied our dropstones. The holes in the stones had been stuffed with chemically treated rags, and I lit them with a spark from my horn before we let them fall. The stones weren't much of a threat. Most of them would bounce off the airship's envelopes before catching the treated fabric on fire, and any halfway decent crew pony could put out such a fire in a few heartbeats. But the long flaming streaks they trailed after them looked quite impressive and threatening, 3. And the Imperials couldn't assume that it wasn't the sort of alchemical fire we had used to such effectiveness on Ironhoof. 3. And just to help that impression, I had added a little bit of a finely ground copper compound to each charge, which gave the flames a lovely green color. Some useless shots from their ship's dorsal copulas meandered up in our direction, one crossbow bolt actually coming to a near stop just below me before falling away. Then the Pegasi boiled out of the top hatch of the ship below me. There were at least 24 of them. As I had feared, they had learned their lesson. So it was time to teach them a new one. I am Twilight Sparkle! You pathetic cowards dare oppose me? With that bit of carefully calculated provocation, they all tried to swarm me at once. Having guaranteed that every one of them would focus their murderous rage on me to the exclusion of all else, I turned tail and dove for Nebula. They all followed, screaming war cries and curses.
It's in the nature of airships to carry their primary weapons below their envelopes. That's because there's only so much weight they can place above their gas cells before becoming dangerously unstable. That's one of the primary reasons why gaining the advantage of superior altitude is so important in most engagements. But because Nebula's relatively heavy hull hung a fair distance below her envelope, she was able to put more weight topsides than was typically safe. With the addition of a massively augmented keel spell powered by the biggest crystal we had on board, and the stabilization of her big steering fins, we had managed to cluster almost all of her main weapons around the 3 hatches on her dorsal surface. This came as something of a surprise to the Imperial forces. In their eagerness to be the heroes who had slain the terrible demon Twilight Sparkle, the Pegasi had all flown directly at me, clustering in a rough line in my wake as I apparently fled in fear. Previous to that day, the best shot I'd ever seen with a net launcher had captured 3 Pegasi at once. Filigree and Cream Puff each bagged 4 with their first launches. They didn't have to slowly crank their weapons back either. The 6 unicorns strapped down to the catwalk rail nearby used their combined magic to reload the weapons almost instantly. The remaining Pegasi scattered, of course, but still lost 4 more of their number to the nets in the first minute of the fight. The parachutes floated them down to the forest below, where they could entertain themselves by trying to cut through the wire-reinforced netting for the next hour or so. Unfortunately, we weren't able to be as non-lethal with all of our countermeasures. The Pegasi that were clear of me became the target of a storm of crossbow fire. The bolts had crescent-bladed heads designed for cutting through lines, netting, and sails. They were far less likely to penetrate our aeronaut armor, but would do much more damage to exposed wings than ordinary pile points. Another half dozen of the attackers floundered earthwards with shredded flight feathers, but there were a couple who cried out and fell like stones. I tried to strike for wings when I turned on my pursuers, but at the speed of Pegasus combat, it isn't always possible to be precise. I had reach on them, thanks to my longer wings and telekinesis, and I easily downed 2 of them before one wisened up and went for her crossbow. When the first bolt whizzed past my ear, the rest saw it and the smart became infectious. They all unslung their bows. The 2 next shots I deflected with small shields cast right in the path of the bolts. The third came from slightly behind me and unluckily hit right at the point between 2 flanchards, penetrating far enough to stick solidly between 2 of my ribs. I felt the shock and then the pain, and knew I'd been wounded, but I didn't have time to evaluate the damage. 4. Sliding plates that cover the sides of the barrel and waist. The hit convinced me I couldn't stand off and keep being a target any longer, so I rushed the remaining Pegasi, lashing out with my wing blades and short swords, grabbing and holding my opponents with magic long enough to get in solid strikes. There's no such thing as cheating in combat. The one that tried to escape met Swiftwing, who hadn't technically disobeyed orders by staying in the air. Swiftwing was very good with his wing blades and finished his opponent before I could join in. With the Pegasi defeated, we landed on Nebula's envelope near the mainmast hatch and I scanned the sky, assessing the situation. Nebula was fast approaching the Imperial ships and rising up beneath them. The ship on our right was slewing off to larboard in a sloppy maneuver for some reason, putting her larboard turret out of firing position, but we were still in a very good position to continue with the primary plan. And there was no sign of any more flyers.
Tell the captain we're still doing horseshoe punch!
I yelled to the pony nearest the speaking tubes. He nodded and blew into the one that went to the quarterdeck.
Ma'am?
One of the gun crew said to me hesitantly.
Did you know there's an arrow sticking out of you?
I glanced at the quarrel and estimated that it had only penetrated an inch or two. Not immediately life-threatening. I couldn't manage the concentrated flash of high heat necessary to cauterize the wound, so I settled for notching the shaft with one of my blades and then stabbing it off close to my body. It probably wouldn't have bled all that much if I had just pulled the whole thing out, but I have a waste not, want not policy toward my own blood, and the day was still young. I didn't really grin so much as bare my teeth at the onrushing Imperials. The guns of their ship on our left were swinging to target, and they were only seconds away from unleashing everything they had on us.
Now comes the fun part.